Buffy, I've got 7:01, so go ahead and start. And folks, I just would like to welcome you to this evening. And this is the College of Arts and Sciences Professional Development Series. I'm very aware that your time is precious and our days are very busy. And so I'm very pleased that so many of you chose to spend the evening in our conversation tonight on equitable recentering in the pursuit of sustainable diversity and inclusive action. For our gathering tonight will be about 90 minutes. Our speaker will present for about an hour, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. We have muted everyone's mic, so we're asking if people, especially when we get to the Q&A, if you could put your questions into the chat, and then Gina Hunter and I and Rocio will call those questions out, and it might be a little bit easier to manage the traffic that way. We would like to thank the Harold K. Sage Foundation for partial funding to this event. And I am particularly indebted to the members of our Growth Change team who were part of the organizing team to get this event set up and organized. I also want to mention that at the end of this, there'll be a survey going out from the college office just to ask for your feedback. And this just helps us in terms of knowing what other needs and requests there are for future professional development. So I would like to turn the formal introduction of our guest over to Dr. Gina Hunter. Gina?
Thank you, Diane, and welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Buffie Longmire-Avital to our campus virtually. She is an associate professor of psychology. She's the director of the Black Lumen Project, which is an equity initiative. And she is the previous coordinator of the African and African American Studies Interdisciplinary Minor, all at Elon University. Dr. Longmire-Avital earned her PhD in Applied Developmental Psychology from New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Her research focuses on how psychosocial factors and systemic injustices contribute to health inequities that impact racial and sexual minorities. She is the author of numerous research articles and the recipient of several research grants and honors. At Elon, she has held a number of leadership roles. She was the Center for Engaged Learning Scholar at Elon from 2018 to 2020. Her CEL blogs focused on how to generate and sustain critically conscious, equitable approaches that support underserved and often invisible students' engagement with high impact educational practices. She has many great blog entries that I have read and enjoyed. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Longmire-Avital last June at the Council for Undergraduate Research's Conference on Centering Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity, where she was both the keynote speaker and a workshop and daily reflection facilitator. I found her research important and insightful, and her framework and guidance on inclusive teaching and mentoring to be practical, positive-minded, and powerful. I am very happy that we have her with us today, and her talk tonight is entitled Equitable Recentering in the Pursuit of Sustainable Diversity and Inclusive Action. Welcome, Buffy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and pin myself so I'm not lost here in the sea of wonderful people that joined tonight virtually. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can jump in to this delicious and meaty and needed topic. So I just want to make sure everybody is seeing the presentation. Great. That is the new check-in in this reality of Zoom world. Can you see what I actually intended to put on the screen? So you can see this is your building. I had some fun perusing your university website as I was getting ready for this and learning a little bit more about you. But the question I want to kind of give us as a framework as we start tonight, and for those of you who may join me tomorrow as we are working in continued professional development, is, are we really talking about historically underrepresented, or are we talking about historically excluded communities and populations and thereby students? I will tell you that if you read my blogs, you will see that I use the term HERMS, historically underrepresented minority students, all throughout. And it wasn't until about a year or so ago that I had a conversation with someone and they said, well, I actually like the terminology excluded, and they explained why, and it stuck. And I'm hopeful that you will understand why I'm starting to make that switch, and hopefully will understand why I challenge all of you to start thinking and making that switch as we go through this presentation and our time today. So I always believe in starting with a quote, because I think, why not? Someone probably said it better. And typically James Baldwin always says it better. And so he writes this beautiful quote where he says, "For these are all our children. We will all profit by or pay for what they become." And if we substitute in the word students, we read, "For these are all our students. We will all profit by or pay for what they come." And if we think about kind of the goal of higher education, that seems to make sense. So who are we talking about when we are referencing our students? Well, if we're looking at kind of national data, this is not data that is specific to ISU, but if we're looking at national trends, the number, the percentage of students, the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds that are enrolled in college or universities in 2010 to 2019 overall has stayed relatively stable, and it's about 41%. That's not unsurprising, but it's not terrific either. We're not looking at numbers of 75% or 85%. We're still less than half of the population that is of that traditional college age actually enrolling into a college or university. When we disaggregate this by race, we see also fairly similar numbers. Certainly, we see some groups that are at a much higher rate than others, and that stayed consistently high when we look at students that identify as Asian. And we're also seeing some places, some areas and groups where there is a much greater deficit or difference, particularly when we're looking at students who identify as Indigenous in terms of where they were in 2010 and where they were in 2019. And of course, we have to point out the fact that this is all data that is pre-pandemic. So we are now moving into uncharted territory, and we're not quite sure what these numbers are going to look like in the future, but it's giving us some kind of indication. If we then add on the layer of gender, right, we engage, and I shouldn't say gender, but I'll say sex, then we move into somewhat of some intersectional territory. Unfortunately, we're losing certain demographic groups. You'll see that we're seeing white, Black, and Hispanic. The data that I'm pulling from has lost Asian. I'm not sure why. But again, we're seeing relatively similar numbers. Now we're seeing for men, it seems to be, for those who identify as male, it seems to be 38 to 37 roughly. For those who identify as women, it's about 44 to 40, stayed relatively at 44, still not pushing over 50%, but it appears that women, for the most part, regardless of their racial identification, are enrolling at a kind of a greater rate than we are seeing men. And I think a lot of us in higher education that are looking at our classes, particularly myself in psychology, have been seeing this pattern for a while. Now, I'm always surprised when I have more than a handful of students in my class that identify as male. But it seems like we're kind of doing okay in terms of numbers, and everybody seems to be staying on a very similar path. But those numbers are misleading, and that's what brings us here today. This is a quote that has stayed with me my entire career as a professor. It is from a conversation that I had with a first-year student in my very first semester of teaching at Elon University. She was in my intro to psychology course. There were 3 of us in the room that identified as racial minorities, and we're in this historically white university in the South. She was from Boston. I am from Cambridge, which is basically the next town over. And at the end of the semester, she asked me if she could get a reference for a transfer. And I didn't understand why. You'd only been here for a semester. I myself remember coming into my undergraduate institution and just being a little bit shocked and thinking, I'm not going to stay here for 4 years, but I did. And so I wanted to understand a little bit more as to why she felt like in only a semester in, she needed to go somewhere else, or maybe not somewhere else at all. She just needed to kind of escape the institution that she was in. And so she started to describe how she was constantly feeling like she was interrupting a conversation when she'd walk into her residence hall dorm room, and her roommates, who were all white, would be talking, and then they would stop and kind of look at her. Sometimes they wouldn't include her in the various different things and activities that they were doing. She talked about how when she was in classes and we would ask students to get into small groups, she'd noticed that everyone would angle their chairs in such a way that she was just a little bit always on the outside. And what she started to describe was this experience of being both paradoxically hyper visible and hyper invisible at the exact same time. And I think if you've read kind of George Yancey's work that talks about the Black body and the white gaze, she was essentially describing this. And so I asked her, not knowing very much of the university, well, is it just kind of our department that you're experiencing it and maybe the group of students you're interacting it, or is this kind of, this is it? And she said, I reached out to other Black students, I've been talking to them, and they said, yeah, this is the experience that we're having. But guess what? This is preparation for the real world. So you should stick it out. You shouldn't leave, because this is what you're going to experience in the real world. And this type of invisibility yet hypervisibility is just kind of training for what you'll experience. And she turned to me, and that's when she said, well, why on earth would I pay for the real world when I can get it for free? And I didn't have a response at that time. And that's what haunts me. I have a response now, but I didn't have a response then. And all I could do was write her a letter. And I wrote her that letter, and I don't know if she enrolled somewhere else. I don't know what came of her. And it is one of the most gut-wrenching frustrations of my life that I wasn't prepared to counter that question that she asked me. And her question aligns with the data that we see here, which is, when we look at who's enrolling, it looks like we're all kind of on the same track. But when we really zoom in and think about who's completing their higher education, who's graduating, that's when we see a different story emerge. That's where we see over a 15-year period, we're seeing numbers like 77 in comparison to 9%, or 65 in comparison to 11%, or 13%. So this is the percentage of bachelor's degrees that were awarded by degree granting post-secondary institutions by race and ethnicity. This is a very drastically different picture than who's enrolling, which means that people are coming in, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're coming out with the intended goal, because we don't ask people to come to our universities just to come and check it out for a semester. We ask them to come because we are expecting, we are hoping, the whole purpose of education is that you go through it to graduate and move on from there. This picture remains when we think about who is in the pipeline to potentially then come back, re-enter higher education in the form of staff or as scholars, as academics. When we look then at who is completing master's degrees, and doctoral degrees as well. We're seeing the exact same pattern. And so when you see this, you see the amount of people who are coming in comparison to the amount of people who are actually graduating, completing the intended outcome of higher education, you should be angry. And you should be asking yourself what's happening. And you should be saying, this isn't just an educational disparity, because a disparity reflects a great difference. This is more than a great difference, because a great difference could be something within a short period of time, but this is over time. And if we spanned out further, we would probably see the exact same patterns. And if we keep going, and who knows what's going to happen as we navigate this pandemic, I'm not quite sure when we'll be post-pandemic. And in fact, when I see these numbers, I think about my feelings when I got to my undergraduate institution my first day, after reading the headline that it was the largest class of African-American students they had ever kind of admitted. I think the number was like 34. And I said to myself, where am I if 34 is considered a large number? It was a smaller liberal arts, but still that is not a significant number. And I remember being out on the quad for orientation and looking around and realizing that there were very few people that looked like me. And I walked away feeling like I was this little chocolate chip in a chocolate chip cookie. And I wrote about that. But then over time, I realized I had the wrong framework, because a chocolate chip cookie, right, reflects this idea that the cookie itself was created to hold the chocolate chips, that the chocolate chips were supposed to be there. In actuality, it was more like a sugar cookie, and I happened to be this random sprinkle with a few of other people that fell into it. Because this system is not an equitable system. We have to acknowledge that education in the US has historically and continues to be in an equitable system. And when we talk about inequities, we move away from just talking about these general differences or thinking we can solve it just by enrolling students. And we start really thinking about, what does that experience through the academy look like, feel like? How is that experience similar and not? How is that experience really a manifestation of historical injustice and unfairness? Inequitable. We have to ask ourselves these questions if we're really thinking about radically moving away from where we have been before. To do this, from my perspective, I think that you need to apply a critical race theoretical lens, because that work has been done. Right? And we just need to look at it a little bit more. And when we apply that work, when we apply that critical race theoretical lens, we start to see the manifestation not of underrepresentation, but of historical exclusion. Bork in 2016 wrote that members of underrepresented racial groups are not only underrepresented numerically, but are also systemically through social structures and the ways in which power is situated among groups. And that includes within our higher education, within our entire kind of lifespan of education within the US. Where does this kind of inequity begin? Well, Solorzano, Perez, Huber, in their recent book around understanding how to apply a critical race theory to responding to racial microaggressions, gives this really poignant frame of kind of looking at and breaking down the history of the US. So if we think about the institution or the potential of the institution of the US starting in 1619, and think about that period of 1619 to 1865, that's reflecting 62% of our US history as a period that had legalized slavery. If we move from 1865 to about 1965, which for the most part reflects our Jim Crow era. We're looking at legalized separation and another 25% of our country's history. And so 87% of our country's history has either had sanctioned slavery or enslavement or brutally enforced separation. And then if we say, well, if we move beyond 1965 to this current era, and we think of it as the modern era of civil rights, we could also refer to it as the new Jim Crow. That's only about 13% of our existence. And we have all bared witness to what is happening in this modern era. We are not a post-racial, post kind of socio-demographic society in terms of marking your positionality at all. And that means that the entire kind of history of the US is marred by the fact that there has been some form of trauma as a function of positionality, and often that positionality kind of being centered first and foremost on race. And that's exactly what Lansing's, Billings, and Tate argue in terms of understanding inequities and the manifestation of this exclusion in this inequitable space in higher education. That we can't forget the centrality of race, and that the fact that we are a race-based society, we can expand that to say a kind of a socio-demographically based society, that these socio-demographic positions determine positionality. We also need to acknowledge the fact that we are a society where power rests in kind of property rights, property ownership. This is how people were given rights to vote in the very beginning, in the conceptions of the US. Well, how does this relate to the academic framework? Well, think about it in terms of curriculum. If property is now who owns the curriculum, who determines what is studied and why, ultimately, who determines what is of value. If we even move out further and think about the intersection of these socio-demographics with this notion of who owns space, who owns property, we start to think about who is maintaining that space. How are we assigning value to scholarship and curriculum and other educational practices, and who gets kind of first access or first dibs in these processes? And we also have to think of how we're evaluating and what is the standard of evaluation. Are we evaluating everyone in an equitable way, or are we evaluating everyone on a framework that centers particular groups and particular experiences as the norm, and everyone else is rated in terms of how close they come to it or how far they deviate from it? I will often say, if you're kind of thinking about what's the center of the Tootsie Roll Pop for the US, it's essentially a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant property owning man throughout US institutions and systems. This ultimately becomes about who has power. Well, what does that mean? All of that, that from that kind of this high level institutional systemic view, what does that mean in terms of the lived experiences of our students? Gina, you will probably remember this from my speech, but I felt like I needed to put the slide back in here as well, because for me, this is the point in time where I realized, reflecting back, that navigating our US education system as a historically excluded minority person is navigating always a potential for trauma. And when we think about it that way, we maybe understand why someone can come into the system and feel unwelcomed and feel like they need to leave the system before they have completed everything they intended to complete. And so this is a courtyard. This is my elementary school courtyard back in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this was a sign of one of the most significant microaggressions that I encountered in my youth. It was at this moment where we were all working in small groups doing a science project. It was Cambridge, so we relied heavily on Harvard and MIT to supply college students who were doing the kind of early indications of academic service learning, where they were coming into schools and working with us. And my group was confused about something. And so I took the initiative, as kind of the star student that I was, to go to the student and ask the student volunteer and ask for clarification. I simply wanted clarification. And in response to my question, the student, unprompted, said, well, Buffy, you wouldn't be such a waste of a student if you listened more. Right? So here he is in this position of assumed power, that he has the ability to evaluate who I am as a student, even though he really doesn't know me outside of these few occurrences that we've had. And not only was this painful, but it altered the way that I then began to navigate the space, because it wasn't until I was a graduate student working with Josh Aronson, who is of the Steele and Aronson of stereotype threat, that he stopped me one day and said, why do you apologize before you ask every question? So I'd be in graduate meetings and I would say, I'm sorry, I have a question. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. I was apologizing, right? Because I had internalized this idea that this space was not for me, that I was the interloper and I needed to apologize. And I was expressing, without knowing, a traumatic response. And so in thinking about equitable frameworks and inclusion frameworks around historically excluded minority students, we have to consider the ways that their psychosocial experience is sometimes a cost to what I refer to that climb, that cost of engaging in higher education and education in general may be a psychosocial one. We have to contend with that. In fact, we'll learn a little bit more, we'll talk a little bit more about this on Friday, but I wanted to put this out there that we have to understand that students from historically excluded minority groups are often experiencing massive amounts of microaggressions daily. Microaggressions are these daily, subtle, not so subtle, implicit, explicit slights that are derogatory to the various identities that they hold, usually minoritized, marginalized identities. But in experiencing these daily microaggressions and just being kind of told that you have to push through it, that this is kind of prep for the real world, you increasingly develop a specific type of stress, a stress that is distinct from just general overwhelmed stress that our collegiate students, our emerging adults are navigating, a stress that we refer to as a minority status stress. And that minority status stress, when it is not kind of checked, becomes a battle fatigue. Williams, Smith and colleagues talks a lot about racial battle fatigue, but I think battle fatigue can be expanded to a lot of minoritized positions within various different settings. And so what does this battle fatigue kind of manifest in? It might manifest as hypervigilance, where again, you're navigating the space of being both hyper visible and hyper invisible at the same time. So you're just kind of sensitive and aware of everything. And you're not really allowing yourself to turn off. You're just constantly kind of, I don't want to say the word defensive, but ready for a potential threat, a potential attack. You apologize, right? Before someone is able to sling that microaggression at you, hopefully trying to deactivate it, but you're constantly thinking about your positionality. It may also result in disassociation, where you say, this isn't the place for me. And I'm just going to come in, get what I need to get, and get out. And I'm not forming the relationships and the connections that we know are so beneficial and crucial to really successful navigation of the higher education landscape and experience, and are tied to whether or not a person will continue on through that pipeline. You're likely to experience some form of burnout, and you may also experience something that I dub achievement dysmorphia. And it's kind of coming out of my work in health around eating disorders. And when you think about body dysmorphia, it's the idea that somebody looks at their body and they see it as bigger than it actually is. And therefore, that is why they feel the need to continue to restrict their eating, to diet, all of these things. Achievement dysmorphia is actually the flip. In this case, what I think happens is that you are creating and navigating, gaining these achievements. But because society just seems to not know how to celebrate what you've done, you internalize that as an indication that the achievement isn't as great as it is. And so you find yourself in a position less likely to say no to things because you are constantly saying, this wasn't enough. I've got to do the next big thing. I've got to do the next thing, the next thing. I think that this leads to student signatures looking like CVS receipts when they are the president, the secretary, the treasurer. They're having this experience, this experience, this experience, this experience, this experience, because they're just racking up these achievements, not really feeling like they've made it to a point where they can say, I'm good. I'm ready to go on to this next step. I've done what I need to do. Right. So there are all these kind of reactions to this battle fatigue as a result of these microaggressions and minority status stress that we have to consider are part of why this education system is inequitable, because the experience, the navigation of the system is inequitable. It is different when you are a historically excluded minority student. One of the most shocking research studies that I did not expect this finding. We were just looking at kind of general mental health, depression symptomatology, and whether or not young women were meeting criteria, what the rates were for major depressive or kind of chronic depressive disorder. And we compared, my student and I, the Black women in our sample to the white women in our sample, thinking, well, we'll say there's no racial difference and we'll move on. And we were shocked to find that there absolutely was a racial difference. That when we were looking at the rates of meeting criteria for major depression as well as kind of chronic depression, the rates for white women was roughly 1 out of 5, right? So about 25% of the women, a little bit over 25%, close to about 30, were meeting criteria. You were much likely to not meet criteria if you were white than meet criteria. It was an entirely different story for the Black women. In fact, they had a rate that looked almost like 1 and 2. So about 50%, and you'll see those bars are quite close to one another, that it seemed like it almost felt like it was a toss of a coin, whether or not this young woman was going to meet criteria for depressive symptomatology that could be potentially diagnosed as major depression or chronic depression. We did not know if these young women were aware of this, if this was an ongoing struggle, if they were seeking treatment. When we tried to figure out why, what was the difference? It can't just be race, but specifically what was going on, we kind of tracked it back to the experience of race-related stress, or that minority status stress, and the kind of chronic onslaught of microaggressions. And this is really a reflection of that battle fatigue. So this finding was important, but it also aligns with a lot of the findings that were already out there. So why are we talking about this now? Why are we so much more kind of energized and concerned about historically excluded minority students in higher education in their experiences, when this is something that has occurred across time? And it's still something that is occurring. The challenge, the changes that we have made changes, but they're certainly not at a pace that we would hope to see. We have never moved kind of in this post kind of socio-demographic society. So why are we so focused on it now, especially since some of this research is decades old? Well, I have a theory. I think other people share my theory as well. And it's because we are approaching an enrollment cliff, right? We know that our kind of current bucket of students that we typically pull from is drying up. We know this because in the late kind of early thousands, right, that 2007, 2008, 2009, we hit a major recession and people delayed having children. So we don't have a lot of children coming that are going to fill those spaces in these universities where we've built our models based on expanding our enrollment consistently every year. And all of this information is kind of pre-pandemic. So I'm not even sure where we are now, kind of going through the pandemic, and where we will be once we someday get through that pandemic. But we know that there's an enrollment cliff coming. In fact, Elon, when we sat down and did a strategic planning, this was front and center, right? How are we going to fight for these students? Because we are located in those areas of the country where we're going to see massive enrollment drops if we're just pulling from kind of that specific area of the country. I'm not a geographic scholar, but I'm thinking that ISU is located in one of those red states in terms of where you're going to be seeing some significant enrollment declines. And this is terrifying because higher education works by having students not only in seats, but also in beds. We are also concerned because the generation that is coming up is a generation that is kind of looking at college a little bit differently in terms of this space where you come to get information. They approach the world in a little bit of an a la carte format, Well, why do I have to go to a college and take all these other courses when I could just find a course online? In fact, now they're a generation, because of the pandemic, that is used to remote learning and online learning. So what's the appeal? They're also being raised by a generation of parents that lived through multiple recessions, tanking job markets, and extreme debt that was not immediately paid off. So they're a little bit more cautious to jump into this world of higher education and what that means. Here's another graphic. Not all schools are going to be affected in the same way by the enrollment cliff. Some schools are going to be affected more. Those regional four-year institutions are right there. And, and again, this is all pre-pandemic. So higher education has been kind of in crisis mode for a while before the pandemic hit, and it's just kind of continued to escalate, trying to prepare for this looming cliff that is coming. Some of the ways that you might do this is by kind of engaging the Common App, because we find once you institute the Common App, enrollment seems to bump up, at least for those first couple of years. We are doing much more rigorous recruitment plans. We're increasing kind of aid packages, and we're also really trying to tap into what are these specific experiences that this generation coming up, this Generation Z and other future generations, are really interested in. So things like internships and study abroad, opportunities to work with individuals, get these experiences so that they know they have skills that they can go out and get that job right away. And where we are is finding that there are certain kind of key things that appear to be pulling students into higher education, as opposed to just kind of going on this kind of less traveled, off the road, less traditional path. One is that we know there's a value in diversity, that students are increasingly saying that they want to be at universities where they can see themselves and where they feel comfortable being their authentic self. So when we think about this increase in focus in diversity, well, it's because it's the right thing to do, but it's also a cost-effective thing to do because a lot of students don't want to go to a university where they feel like they are going to be constantly navigating microaggressions, especially if they know they can go to another type of university. What's very interesting is the universities that and colleges that are on the rise are your universities that are minority serving or historically Black, because you can choose to go to a university where you don't have to be kind of historically excluded and invisible. You can be fully embraced. And so as a response, we are pivoting and thinking more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are also realizing, I think my colleague Peter Felton was actually at your university maybe a few weeks ago talking about the importance of relationships, that still the key aspect, a beautiful takeaway of having a kind of college experience is not just like you're getting to do this experience, but that these kind of gold standard experiences come with the potential of relationships in the form of really impactful mentorship. And that is still a big draw. And I think part of pushing back against that enrollment cliff is doubling down on our ways in which we get students to connect with and have these deep, profound relationships that really truly see them and are helping them navigate these experiences. That for me, a high impact practice is not just kind of it checks certain boxes, but that it's a mentored process. And we know we need to increase access to them, but we need to increase that access to that mentorship. And so we find ourselves at this space of kind of transparent material determinism. That's a terminology from Derek Bell, or you might call it a convergence of interest, where we know we've got this looming enrollment cliff. We know that perhaps one of the things that could solve that enrollment cliff is more engagement in high impact practices, because that increases the chances that a student is going to form this kind of deep relationship and community, either with other students or a faculty or a staff member. And we also know that we need to expand our understanding of who should be in these spaces. That this space shouldn't just default to one type of student, but it really has to be inclusive of all potential students. And so we are reevaluating, looking at our historically underrepresented, our historically excluded students in a different way. And I think this is the moment of convergence where we start to really think about what does it look like to be intentional around our creation of high impact practices that are really going to speak to the needs and the experiences of our historically excluded minority students, especially because we know the benefits of these practices are so grand. So here's the thing. You can build it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they will come. You have to be intentional. You have to be thoughtful all the way through. I have seen many a program built and really not capture that essence that's missing, that special ingredient to actually pull students in. And for me, that kind of special sauce, that special ingredient is critical mentoring that is custom fitted for not only the lived experience of students, our historically excluded minority students, but is also custom fitted to consider the experiences and the needs and the journey they have yet to travel once they leave the higher education world or continue on within the higher education world. Leo, Martinez, Rotherham, and Fuller in 2016 defined critical mentoring as a reciprocal reflexive process that prepares the student, i.e. the mentee, for a world that is historically inequitable and is characterized by dynamic changes in social, political, economic, and power relationships. So for me, again, what I think is that central to their conceptualization of critical mentoring is the role of the mentor. And they view the mentor as this amplifier of the mentees, kind of what we'll get into, cultural capital or skills, what they're already bringing to the table and what they want to bring to that future table once they graduate, right? So in simple terms, this critical mentorship is really about this commitment from the mentor to want to actively champion the success of their student above all other outcomes, and intentionally centering students that have historically not been at the center. So how do we do this? How do we build a critical mentoring kind of model or approach within our institution? It's not something I think you can do without some form of institutional support. I'm thankful at Elon that for us engaging in, for example, an undergraduate research is something that counts towards the workload that we're doing. We're either paid overage or we can kind of bank our hours to allow us to get a course release at a later time. We are given stipends to work with students over the summer. They really kind of invested in this idea that to give of this mentorship time, you needed to have supports as well to be able to do that. So I do acknowledge the fact that you cannot, it's very hard to do this when the institution isn't ready to support you. You can do variations of it. I think that we have to be brave and apply a critical theoretical approach to designing what we want out of this experience. We have to first be willing to acknowledge that there are intersecting forms of oppression. So creating any type of kind of support or network that is solely focusing on one identity and not acknowledging how a student can have multiple identities that are experiencing oppression means that you've got missed opportunities there. We need to be open to the fact that oppression tends to be intersecting, right? If we say, well, we're going to solve our diversity, equity, initiatives by only focusing on race and not considering sexuality, not considering socioeconomic status, not considering gender, then we're really not seeing the true lived experience of our students. We can't do this work decontextualized. We have to bring in the context. We have to be willing to push away from kind of traditional models, and we have to see it as an arm of social justice, that this is the right thing to do, that we are kind of responding to historic wrongs. And it's time that we do it. We have to center and value experience epistemology. We have to listen to the voices of our students. We have to listen to the voices of our faculty and staff who've been on the front lines, who have had the lived experience. And we need to not just prioritize kind of this scholarly knowledge, but the knowledge that comes from the lived experience in crafting these types of programs and the various layers that go with it. And we have to be willing to work transdisciplinary. It's really hard to do this in silos. A lot of times I will see, we'll do something where we'll say, well, these are for the STEM fields, and this is for performing arts. But we need to be willing to work across these various disciplinary divisions and think about how working transdisciplinary, working in teams, one, alleviates the possibility that we are putting the onus onto certain faculty members and staff, namely faculty members and staff that also identify as historically excluded, minoritized persons, and creating a workload and a communication and a nuanced kind of environment that is really reflective of the complexities in the ways that we live. It is an opportunity for collaboration, not for competition. The second thing I think we need to think about is this idea of capital. And capital in the sense that when we think about higher education, when we think about research in higher education, we tend to think about how higher education is framed as this great benefit, this great mobilizing agent, social mobility agent for people who enter into this space. And that is true. But do we ever stop to think about what we are benefiting from our students who are interacting in space, what we are getting out of having our students in the space, what they are bringing with them into the space, and how we could benefit from that? And so there is a challenge here to incorporate kind of Yoso's framework around this idea of community cultural wealth. How are we creating opportunities to see the values, the skills that our students are bringing with them from their home communities, from their previous experiences? This goes back to how we are evaluating or indicating readiness and success for our students. For example, linguistic communication experiences. You have a student who perhaps is bilingual, or perhaps that student is effective at code switching, right? And that code switching, that ability to understand how to navigate multiple spaces and flip back and forth between them, or the ability to navigate spaces in one language and then seamlessly transition to navigating a space in another language, can be a tremendous asset to the discourse in your class, to a research study that you are trying to do, to a service learning opportunity or an internship. How are you finding out that this student is bringing this ability? Are they thinking that they have to come into your class and just present this one kind of cookie cutter format? Do they have the space to showcase what they can do? Think about that in terms of the assignments that we ask them to do, the various different opportunities that we ask our students to engage in. The third thing is that I believe we need to think about this as a reparative process, that we need to think about what has been historically denied, or at least the inequity in terms of what has been achieved and what an individual has had to then face to kind of navigate the world beyond and navigate the space that we are currently in. And so I believe in the importance of signature work, but I believe that signature work should be viewed as a reparative outcome. And when I think about signature work, I'm going to cite AAC and U's definition from 2015, where they say signature work is each student addresses one or more problems that matter both to the individual student and to the society as a whole. It's your way of leaving a mark. Now, it's not an invitation to kind of engage in saviorism, but it's where do you see a need and where can you work to address that need, hopefully in a collaborative and respectful way. But it's also about what you are taking with you to the next step. And for us in academia, if we've been here long enough, we think about publications. We think about just the fact that you had this experience, that you can just write it on your resume or CV. That's enough. But we have to remember, when we are working with historically excluded minority students, that they are going out into a world that is not going to evaluate their CV or their resume in the same way that it will evaluate somebody else's who is not from an historically excluded minority community. They need amplifiers. It's unfortunate, but it is the case. And sometimes that amplifier is a distinct kind of product or experience that they can speak to that says, yes, I can in fact do this job or be in this program, and here's the proof. Here's what I can show you. So these are a few examples of students that I've worked with. My student who was going on to graduate school, so she wanted to do posters and an article. That's what she needed to give her capital as she was navigating her space. Another student is not really interested in graduate school, but she is more so interested in doing more community workshops. And so she worked with me to develop an online intervention that she can take with her, and she can do that intervention on kind of engaging self-compassionate behavior somewhere else. And then finally, another student who was actually a theater arts major, so not a psychology student at all, who wanted to work with me on his lived experience as a Black gay man. And he felt, I don't need to write a paper, but I could put together a short film production based on the results that we found. Now, I can't publish a short film, but for him, that's what he needed in terms of the next step that he was going in. So when we put this all together, it looks like this, at least in my mind, that we start with this intentional representation and recruitment. And when that starts in the classroom, that starts in the various co-curricular opportunities that we present students with. We always center and think about the student's self-care and well-being, because we acknowledge that there has always been higher education has been a place of trauma, and it continues to be, whether we see it or not. We know that it exists. We navigate and work with this student in a space of inclusive critical consciousness, one that creates what I refer to as mutual vulnerability, where we are sharing of our experiences as well as allowing and encouraging them to share their lived experiences, that they don't think that they have to come into spaces and just turn this element off, that they can bring that in and they can be shown how this can be incorporated into their strategic next step, that we are amplifying and recognizing their cultural wealth, and that ultimately we are moving towards helping them leave with some type of transportable signature work that is capital building and is tailored to their next step. In all of this, we also have to consider our own self-care, because this takes time. And this is where there is a charge to your institution to think about how best they can support you. And so my hope is that when we approach this model of critical mentoring, when we center the idea of the relationship and we center the fact that that relationship is critically important for students from communities that have been historically denied the same experience, an equitable experience as other members of the community, that we start to reinforce roots that are going to serve them as they move out. So I will leave you with this last quote, which is an African proverb. I think it's fitting if you start with James Baldwin, you end with an African proverb. And this is really my why in mentoring. What I think the ultimate purpose of mentoring is that when the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. If we can bring students into these spaces and truly help them be equipped with the skills or the recognition of their own skills to weather whatever the storms of injustice they will weather moving on through their journeys of life, then we have done what we should be doing. And I think we can do that through intentional, reparative, critical mentoring through these high impact practices. So on that note, I will stop share. And hopefully we have some time for conversation. I timed myself, so either I timed it wrong or
Buffy, I just have to say that was both, it was inspirational and aspirational for us, yet it was very pragmatic in calling us to what we need to do. Jean, I think we want to open up for Q&A. And we had asked if people could put questions into the chat. It might be a little easier to manage. So get your questions queued up.
it was a lot.
Buffy, it was a lot, so well organized and so accessible.
Well, thank you for that. The running joke with my students is like, you're not going to leave a class not knowing something. She will hammer you with information. No student has ever walked out of my class and said, oh goodness, I didn't learn anything, or I wasn't presented with anything. But I also understand that it takes a moment to just process that. It's late in the evening. So absolutely, please take your time and process, and also know I'm here tomorrow as well.
And Buffy, Rosie and I are kind of texting back and forth here, and we're a little bit smaller group than what we thought. There are things are going to be more people here tomorrow, and I think we're pretty. I think we feel pretty safe that there's no nefarious.
Yeah, go ahead and unmute. Right? People want to just ask their question.
Why don't we just unmute and let you just ask your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I hit the right button. So
yes.
Yeah.
Risha, if you want to unmute.
Sure. I don't need to go first if there was someone ahead of me, though.
I think so.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much for that talk. It was really, it gave us a lot to think about, all of us, I'm sure, myself certainly. I was just wondering, I really appreciated how you mentioned the fact that, sometimes it's hard to do this work without the material institutional support for this kind of work. And, without that support, the burden of doing this work tends to fall in a really detrimental way on particular staff or faculty members. Which effectively can penalize them in the sense of, taking time away from other things that they have to be doing in order to get promoted and all the rest of it. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, some of the ways in which, if you think there are some good models out there or best practices for how, faculty doing this kind of mentoring or staff doing this kind of critical mentoring, ought to be supported, so that they can do the other things so they get some credit, do the other things, have the time and the space to do the other things that they're meant to do in their jobs, but also so that, you avoid having like a kind of like a transactional relationship with the people that you're also being vulnerable with and trying to have an intimate relationship with. So you don't just then go back to your office and say, okay, talk for 5 minutes with so-and-so, like add it to the pile so that I can get a course release in 6.5 years or whatever. Right. I just wondered if you had some thoughts about, how institutions can support faculty and staff doing this important work.
Yeah, I think that is a great question. I want to also say that where I was when I was starting my faculty career pre-tenure and what those kind of signature outcomes could be, signature work outcomes for students, they needed to align with the fact that I was going up for tenure and I needed publication. So I will own that and say that some of the more creative outputs that you're seeing that are not necessarily those things that I would put in a promotion packet for, for need for tenure are a function of the fact that I do have tenure and I'm and very close to that full faculty rank. So I think part of that mentored self-care is one, both the institution encouraging and recognizing that the type of outcome engagement that you can have with a student, it has to align with where you are also at in your academic career, that you cannot be expecting a newly minted faculty member that's got about 6 years to get themselves together and get through tenure to be doing these massive, far-reaching, kind of high impact practice mentoring roles. Maybe they can do it on one that kind of absolutely aligns with what they need to have in terms of their outcome. I think that this is a space to be creative and innovative in terms of how we continuously keep associate faculty and full faculty engaged and working with students. I think that typically when we think about working with students, we tend to think of that assistant professor who's got to work with a ton of students to help them get their research, or is expected because everybody else in the meeting kind of says not it, and you realize you don't have tenure, so there's no point in putting your your finger on your nose. I've been there, I understand it, but I think that this is where an institution can push back and kind of say, listen, let's think about our full faculty, our associate faculty that might just need to, are looking for something new, or this is a way to engage them and push back at that kind of disassociation that tends to happen at that period of time in the career. So shifting kind of who are we expecting to be engaging and working with students and supporting and maintaining these programs. So I think that that's kind of it's more of a faculty lifespan approach in thinking about how you are engaging this work. I think that you have to have kind of institutionally protected time in certain ways. So for us at Elon, it's easy to mentor a bunch of students, for example, in undergraduate research, and you're collecting all this data, and then I become a data hoarder, where I've just got data files sitting on my computer and I just don't have the space to write, because when I would write, then something else comes up. And so I really benefited from the idea of writing boot camps, where essentially they would have faculty volunteer to come and sit in a room, and you were given breakfast and lunch, and you just had a quiet space to write. And you could check in at the end of the day in terms of what you have completed. We have continued to do that in an online format. So everybody comes onto Zoom, you turn your camera off and you mute yourself, but you're supposed to be working. It's a little of the honor system on a writing project, and then you can report out in small groups. And so what are the ways that the institution is, Elon kind of structured opportunities to kind of move our work along so that we could hit those benchmarks that we needed to hit. I also think that you have to have chairs and deans that are trained to have an equitable and inclusive framework, so that they are spotting when a faculty member is being consistently tapped, especially if that faculty member is from a historically excluded and a more vulnerable community. And they need to be empowered and expected to kind of say, wait a second, let's think about your professional development plan. Let's think about your career as a faculty member. I understand your desire to want to take on this group of students or another student because you feel this need, or maybe you're thinking that there's this implicit assumption that you should, but that is not the case. And so I think that there has to be intentional critical mentorship from your administration and working with your faculty as well to make sure they're not taking on more than they need to. The other thing I think we need to consider is the role of staff, that we tend to think about working with students, especially in high impact practices, as kind of this faculty thing, that model. But what does it look like when we include staff in that space? What if staff are co-mentoring, for example, a student with you or a group of students with you? How can they be tapped? Now they're tapped as well, but there may be some interesting and innovative ways to kind of share that that burden. And the final thing I'll say is you got to ante up. It costs money. It costs money. I don't know what, I mean, diversity doesn't come for free. Like, you got to pay for it. So if you can have a vision of what your field of dreams looks like, but you got to put money to actually make it, and then to fund the people to go out and engage, to bring your students in to interact with you. And I think getting on similar pages and looking for strategic partnerships across institutions to see where this pot of money could potentially fund a variety of different spaces feels perhaps more appealing to administration, and recognizing that you got to kind of spend money to make money. The students aren't going to, if you cut everything, then there's nothing for them to come to, which is going to propel you faster over the cliff. You don't have to spend like you're a kid with a gift card in a toy store, but you need to recognize that you just can't not spend money on this. You have to be willing to invest.
Buffy, thank you for calling out budget and staff. So appreciated. And I do want to, you gave an opportunity for a small commercial because you talked about writing boot camp, and we have AVP Craig McLaughlin here who helps fund Fourth Fridays up in the library near Gina, and also intensive writing camp in the summer. And what happens at writing camp stays at writing camp is the motto. So just they're highly effective in terms of really pushing people in their research. Buffy, we had a question in the chat from Nathan Stevens. And Nathan, you asked suggestions for alternative forms of evaluation.
Yeah, in your talk, you talked about evaluating in a different way. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what you consider alternative forms of evaluation. And I think you were talking at that point about student work and student assignments.
Yes, so student assignments and also evaluating kind of who is ready to engage in this particular high impact practice. So, you know, I'll use undergraduate research because I tend to lean towards that a little bit more. But with undergraduate research, we say things like, well, we want students to have taken a certain number of classes, that they have to have a certain grade, that they have to show a level of kind of writing aptitude in a certain way. And what we find is we keep getting the same type of student over and over and over again. And I realized this and started kind of thinking like, well, what type of student do I really need? I don't necessarily need the student that knows everything the minute they come and sit down and work with me in research. I can teach you that. But perhaps I'm looking for a student that is just making really interesting connections in class, or they're talking about their lived experience, and I'm realizing that they have a sensitivity and an awareness that I can't necessarily teach. And that is coming from these various kind of buckets of capital that students are bringing with them. I think you want to look at, you know, if you have like an honors program or you have a scholars program, why is it that certain students tend to be the ones that meet the criteria to get into these programs? You really want to have these serious conversations around, well, what is it really that a student needs to ultimately be successful? And think about what our role is. Are we expecting students to essentially be able to do the task or the job we are actually responsible for teaching them before they even get there? And is that really fair? So I'm thinking, when I think about evaluation, I think about that. And I also think about the opportunities to use assignments towards, you know, grades in class that give students room to really start reflecting and opening up about the various different experiences, the various different talents and capital that they are bringing. What can you use this as an opportunity to learn from your students in order to kind of identify students that have a really interesting question? And yeah, maybe they weren't the highest performing student in the class, but they have a really interesting question. And what can you do with that? And then the last thing I will say is, I think, especially when it comes to bias in evaluation, we tend to use a lot of evaluation that is based on how people are presenting in a class and in a space. So we tend to assume that the student that's sitting up front and ready to, you know, and like is right there is like in it, and that's the student that is really engaged and wants something out of this. And I don't think that's the truth. I call it strategic positioning in terms of a few of my students, particularly my students of color, that a lot of times they will take the back row with their back against the wall, or if I'm teaching, they sit in the very front row. And I think those two positions are strategic, because if you're sitting on the back row, you don't have to look your classmates in the face when they say that thing all the way left that is really microaggressive, and you got a little bit of security. If you sit in the front row, you get to just engage with me, and you can kind of almost like you have a blurry filter on, not see the other students that are in the space that have the potential to, again, inflict some type of harm. And we might view those students who seem less inclined to work in a small group, who are always sitting in the back and are maybe quiet, not saying anything, as students that are not really committed and engaged in their higher education, their learning. And I don't think that's the case. I think you're seeing students that are surviving, and we should be respecting that. And we should be really asking ourselves, why do they need to survive in this climate? What can we do better? Nathan, I hope that answers the question.
Beautifully. Thank you.
Other questions for Buffy? I also want to just comment on a chat in here. Becky, your little one interrupted, and this is being recorded, as you can see. The recording is kept entirely in-house. It's on the College of Arts and Sciences professional development page. And I know, Buffy, I am going to go back and look at this again, maybe multiple times. There is so much in here. And I'm thinking of several people who were not able to be here tonight that are going to get this link from me tomorrow. Karen, did you have a question? You're unmuted. Can't tell.
Well, I was going to ask if you could send it to the School of Social Work. I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of folks
Yeah.
who would like to,
Yeah, absolutely.
see it. I guess, Buffy, I think you used the term take up space. I loved that term. And as you were describing students, I had so many student faces going through my mind. And when we get to a particular classroom, so you've talked a lot about some more meso level kinds of supports, but when you're in a classroom and you see a student in the very back, or you see a student with head down, when you hear a student saying, "I'm sorry," before everything the student says, I mean, I have before even touched their hand and said, don't apologize, you belong here. But it's so weak. It seems so weak. It seems so insufficient in the broader context, because maybe I can establish some trust, but is the trust misplaced? Not necessarily in me, but is the trust misplaced in that space, in that classroom? So maybe it's an unanswerable question, because it's more about these individual relationships within a classroom. But I see those faces. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I feel like my arm is too short to reach that student who's sitting in the back or sitting with their head down, even over an extended period of time, even over a semester or 2 semesters. I was imagining even saying to a class of students, and most of our students are women, it could apply to women in general, just to use that mantra, take up space. I don't know if that would be something that that could become like a slogan for a class, even if we can't bring a student out, to maybe have it be something they can take with them as they move forward.
And I think it's important to recognize that they're on a developmental journey. And so some students are coming in and are fully aware of inequities and kind of that gaze that they're navigating, and they kind of maybe stumble at some points, but for the most part, they they've got their strategies down and they know how to just kind of push through. And other students are kind of getting this microaggressive, you know, I call it the microaggressive whiplash, where you think, I'm here, I'm okay. This is the opportunity where everybody should be informed and I shouldn't experience these things. And then they experience it. And it's like, oh, okay, I'm right back to where I am. And what does that mean in terms of where I am in my identity? When you were talking about that, it was making me think about a student that I had in a class about 2 years ago. It was a class that was using only scholars who identified as BIPOC in our course. Like, so the entire psychology course was basically like, we're gonna reclaim space. Like, you know, you learned about identity based on Erickson's model and what happens when you learn about identity using William Cross's Nigressen's model, right? Like, what does this look like when we entirely and intentionally center the BIPOC experience? And I thought it was going to be like, I mean, for lack of a better phrasing, I thought it was going to be like Wakanda for my students of color. They were all going to come in and I was just going to have like my closest to an HBCU kind of moment that I could have. And in actuality, what happened was I had one student of color and all the rest were white. And I was like, okay. And there were white students who were, you know, who intentionally selected the class and wanted to be there. And I recognized that ironically, on a conversation around acknowledging cultural capital, that the Black student was very quiet, and she had been quiet, the class before. And I just kind of kept my eye on her. And for whatever reason, she felt she needed to come over to me, and she said, I want to explain why I'm quiet. I have things to say, but I am so tired of being the spokesperson and the example that just, and explaining the nuance, that I just don't think I can do it right now. So I'm here, I'm showing up, but I'm just not participating in maybe the way we traditionally look at participation. And sometimes for a student, just coming to class is the participation. And that's not setting the bar low, but that's recognizing what survival has to look like for some of our students. And so we talked about what strategies she could use in that class. And one of the things we came to was the ways I could use space. So what would it mean if I was intentionally standing near her at times? That I knew not to call on her until she was ready to speak and to engage, that I could effectively be her anchor with my physical presence. But we had that conversation. And I think once we had that conversation, something kind of clicked. And it was interesting that the next class, it didn't take her but a few minutes before she was jumping in. Now, I also recognize the fact that she and I shared a gendered racial identity. And so that is a component to it. But I think, that idea of reclaiming, thinking about how we use space, how we are engaging eye contact, a willingness to, how we're using our curriculum intentionally to center certain experience and amplify lived experience, and to signal that this experience, your experience, matters, but we need to do so carefully. We can't use curriculum that amplifies a lived experience that we're not qualified to teach, right? So we have to do it in a respectful manner. But I think that there are ways of reclaiming that space. And I also think that that space doesn't end at the classroom, that it is okay to send out an email and say, hey, I read this thing that you wrote and it got me thinking, would you like to talk further about it? And maybe that student will be like, no, they're not in a space they're ready to, but they will remember that the offer was made. And then you think about how you can reclaim even more space in the next class that you work with as well.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I think we still have a couple minutes for other questions or comments or sharing experiences.
Well, I'm glad that you said comment because I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. First and foremost, I just want to say you are beautiful. Um, and then second, I really enjoyed your talk and the language that you used instead of historically underrepresented, historically excluded. I think that language matters. And I thank you for doing a great job at explaining, taking us really throughout history up until now and talking about the reasons why it matters, the significance. So I just wanted to say thank you for your talk. You did a great job.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Other comments, questions? Gina?
Maybe Buffy would want to give just a little plug about tomorrow for those of us who are here today, so we know what we're going to do tomorrow.
Yes, well, it certainly will be much more interactive, but I think we really need to be thinking about not just who our students are, but we really need to be thinking about ourselves. And I don't think that you can do effective kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion work if you don't spend the time really thinking about yourself, the expectations, the assumptions that you are making, your own identity. And I think we are a society that is all about crafting images, but we are not a society that takes enough time to be thinking about our identity and thinking about how we are maneuvering and navigating through this space. And what does that mean in terms of what we can bring for our students? I also think that you need to have common language around a shared vision around what does diversity, equity, and inclusion look like for your institution. There are tons and tons of statements out there, and people felt, especially in the last few years, felt like they needed to rush and put statements out there. But now is really the time to really be thinking about what does diversity, equity, inclusion really realistically, feasibly look like? What are those goals for ISU, and how are you fitting within that in terms of your own positionality and identity? So we're going to be doing a lot more self-work, self-reflection, because the critical mentor, that relationship, it does not work if we're not cognizant of ourself as well.
And just a reminder, our session tomorrow, it's 1 to 2:30, and it'll be the same length that you used tonight. Anybody want to wrap up question or comment?
I'll just say that you've shared a lot and you've given a lot to think about, and I agree with your last statement. And one of the things that I teach my students is that we all have our identities, and we all have assumptions about other people's identities. And so I tell them, whenever you enter a room, you bring yourself. Most of you anyway, right? We usually hold a little bit back. I said, but then everyone brings themselves. And so we make assumptions about others based on our socializations and our lived experiences. So when that last point you made, I asked my students last semester, who are you?